I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We're speaking midweek, and nothing is set in stone, but it is looking more likely that President Biden will get his public works and social and climate spending bills passed. The bills could define Biden's presidency and his legacy, but the spending bill will be much less than he first proposed, which will disappoint many of his supporters. The Times writes, quote, accepting less and calling it a win has its own limits and consequences. And Biden's job approval polls remain anemic. Reuters Ipsos has him with 46% approve, 48% disapprove. Gallup has him at 42% approve, 52% disapprove. And meanwhile, there's a high-stakes political drama in Virginia. Terry McAuliffe locked in a dead heat with Trump-supporting Republican Glenn Youngkin in the race for governor. A Monmouth poll has them tied at 46 apiece. The Times writes, quotes, for Democrats, the stakes have never seemed higher. A defeat for Mr. McAuliffe, a popular former governor seeking his old job back, could deal a devastating blow to the party's confidence heading into next year's midterms and to its strategy of running against Mr. Trump, even when he is not on the ballot. Let's take the political polls starting with Virginia, with Trip Gabriel, national political correspondent for the Times, and Reid, Epstein, political correspondent for the New York Times. Trip, what is at stake for both parties in Virginia?
Hello, Sam, from Richmond. So I'm feet on the ground here, as we say. Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points. The current Democratic governor won it by 9 points 4 years ago. As you mentioned, the polls show this a margin of error, tied up race. It is both the first major election, since the presidential election last year, and then a year in advance of the midterms next year, at which the control of Congress is in the balance. And it is, a state that the Democrats feel they should own. They have won every statewide election here since 2009. So if Glenn Youngkin does win, it is going to send a lot of shockwaves through the Democratic Party, not just in Virginia, but up on Capitol Hill and nationally. And it will be seen as a referendum on President Biden, whose approval has been, in difficult straits here lately. So the stakes are lower for Republicans. If Glenn Youngkin, wins, of course, that's earth-shaking. But even if he comes close, if he loses by a point or two, that will be a proof of concept, so to speak, that a Republican can win by uniting his own party and even bowing, genuflecting a little bit to Donald Trump without Trump on the ballot, and not scaring away the independent voters, the suburban voters, who have tended to make a difference, or did make a difference in the Trump era in terms of Democratic wins.
Trip, given the Biden turnout, the Biden election, given the record of Democrats in the state, why is it as close as it seems to be in the polls?
Well, Virginia is a perfect kind of a state for how elections in the Trump era have been determined. I mean, elections here are won in the suburbs, and suburban voters sort of make up the population centers in Virginia, and really have but are not dyed-in-the-wool Democrats or dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. There's a lot of kind of in-between voters. Sometimes they call themselves independents. Some weeks they might call themselves Republicans or Democrats. But those voters have been up for grabs, and certainly the polls indicate that they're up for grabs again. Biden did very well with suburban voters last year, but Democrats lost a lot of down ballot races in state legislatures in some of the same places, the suburban places that Joe Biden won. So we're going to see, whether those voters are, committed to Democrats, or the Democrats just rented them last year, in Biden's victory.
Reid, we've talked a lot about comparing Joe Biden to FDR, the FDR presidency. We're looking now almost a full year of Joe Biden's presidency. And a lot of people are disappointed. FDR did a lot more, obviously, in his first year, but we're seeing some things toward the end of this first year that might match it. Senate Democrats, as the Times reported this week, talk about imposing a 15% minimum tax on corporations based not on the profits they show to the IRS, but the profits they report to their shareholders. And billionaires would face a tax on unrealized gains in the value of their liquid assets. At the same time, if Congress is able to pass the social and climate change programs that the president has proposed, that would move a lot closer to the cradle to grave social programs that the president has proposed originally, if not the original versions of them. Is that likely to pass? And if it is, what kind of legacy does it give the Biden presidency in this first year?
Well, let's just say there's a long way, as we talk midweek, there's a long way to go before they reach agreements on things to pass. I think by the time this airs, folks might have a better idea, but there's certainly a lot of pessimism at this moment that Democrats will be able to find agreement with the key senators on this. Of course, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who have been resistant, frankly, on different issues. They each have, Sinema is negotiating about 3 or 4 different agenda items at the moment. Manchin is reluctant to sign on to some of the climate proposals and some of the more aggressive tax structures that have been proposed. It's not certain by any means that they will reach a deal or that the deal will be something that is that everyone is happy about. On the FDR point, we're talking now in late October. It feels almost like a mistake for Biden to have fashioned himself after FDR, given that he was always working with very slim majorities in the House and the Senate. FDR had a much more significant mandate, both electorally and in his majorities in Congress, to do the really big things. It's not saying that Biden can't get this over the wire or won't be able to get it done, but we saw at the end of September where Democrats in Congress were working with an arbitrary deadline that they had set to pass these bills. This week is another arbitrary deadline, and there's nothing saying that they can't push this back another month or frankly another 6 months and try to deal with it at another time. It doesn't appear that they're going to give up on it, but the odds remain fairly long that they will get something to the president's desk, certainly in the next few days.
Reid, we talked last week on the program about Joe Manchin sort of hijacking the president's agenda. Is there anything that President Biden can do to persuade Manchin to go along with this program?
Well, he's had him to his house in Delaware. They met on Tuesday. He had him to the White House on Tuesday. Manchin is meeting again with White House staff on Wednesday. I think if there was something that President Biden could do to turn Joe Manchin on some of these issues, he probably would have done it several weeks ago. Manchin is a bit of a unicorn in Democratic politics at the moment, in that he is somebody who represents a state that went to Donald Trump by more than almost a 2-to-1 margin in 2020. And Democrats know that there's not a whole lot of pressure that they can put onto Manchin because, frankly, in West Virginia, they're not going to do much better than him. There's a lot of primary threats out there, people talking about challenging Kyrsten Sinema from the left when she's next up for re-election in 2024. But nobody says that about Joe Manchin, frankly, because they know it's not a winning argument.
Trip, in Virginia, they're trying to make it a referendum on Donald Trump. Is it, in fact, a referendum on Donald Trump, number one? And number two, is Biden much of a factor and his record in that gubernatorial election?
Yes and yes, Sam. McAuliffe campaign, the Democrats campaign, number one issue here is Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. Whether that succeeds is going to be one of the big things, that in the tea leaves that we'll be reading the day after or next Wednesday. Does a Republican on the ballot without Donald Trump on the ballot really bring out the Democratic base? And what you hear in Virginia, which has elections every single year, is that Democratic voters are just tired. They voted against Donald Trump and a Republican candidates in overwhelming numbers in the last 4 years. Trump is no longer in the White House. He's no longer on social media. It's not a to the barricades moment for the Democratic base. Correspondingly, Joe Biden is on the ballot. I mean, this gubernatorial race a year after a presidential race is always seen as kind of a referendum on the party in the White House. And in going back 40 years, there's only been one instance in which the party that holds the White House has won the Virginia governor's race. Actually, it was Terry McAuliffe in 2013. So, structurally, this is a very, very heavy lift. Biden's approval polls are hurting. Going back to what's going on Capitol Hill, the Democrats have found themselves almost in a Obamacare type moment. I mean, they came in with these very ambitious set of social programs and climate programs. And even if the package that does get through, contains even just a part of those initiatives, I mean, it's going to be a significant achievement. But what it appears to many people, because it's dragged on for months, and it seems like the Democrats are not especially competent. They're not especially getting things done in Washington. So they have an image problem with this package, which it seems to be limping toward a finish line rather than something that they can launch with a high amount of ceremony and trumpet as a major FDR-like triumph.
And Trip, I would add to that. I went to see President Biden and Terry McAuliffe campaign in Virginia Tuesday night, and Biden, in 16 or so minutes of remarks, made just like one passing reference to the social agenda that he's trying to push through the Congress. Almost all of his speech was Trump, 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 Trump. And he at one point said that Glenn Youngkin doesn't want to talk about Trump, but he does. It was very much reminiscent of the 2020 campaign where President Biden won. And it felt a lot like Biden and McAuliffe both would prefer to rerun the 2020 campaign as opposed to having made any adjustment to Trump being out of office.
Well, he won that campaign, at least in Virginia, which would suggest that no wonder he wants to rerun that. But is that going to work, number one? And the Democrats are saying, it's insurrection versus infrastructure, which may be a little bit of a leap. But how long, as we've discussed on this program before, can the Republicans just win or get along with saying no to everything while the Democrats are at least trying to enact some sort of a program? Reid.
Well, that was their playbook in the throughout the Obama years. It didn't kill them. We have extreme partisanship in this country. The electoral map and the Senate map is structurally unfavorable to Democrats. So, being the party of obstruction for Republicans has not cost them a lot. In these midterm elections and in these congressional, in the elections that determine the control of the chambers of the Senate and also at the state level, you could say. So it is, the presidential election last year, in some ways, I think, is looking more and more sui generis, a kind of one-off, thumbs down on a chaotic and divisive presidency, and we don't have that. We don't have Trump to to kick around anymore. At least immediately. I mean, I think that certainly if Youngkin wins, the Democrats are going to have to tear up their midterm playbook. Sean Patrick Maloney, who's the representative from New York, who chairs the campaign committee for Democrats, in the House, he's been out saying to all his frontline members in competitive districts, run against Trump, run against the toxicity of Donald Trump, even though Trump's not on the ballot. If it doesn't work here in Virginia, it ain't going to be working in the suburbs of Philadelphia or the suburbs of Omaha or pick any battleground state next year where the control of Congress will be in the balance.
Well, we'll be watching what you guys write next week. Thank you, Reid Epstein, Trip Gabriel of the New York Times. And coming up next, how much trouble is Big Tech in? We'll hear from Swisher. A few weeks ago, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal said, quote, Facebook and big tech are facing a big tobacco moment. Republican Senator Cynthia Lummis replied, I think that's an appropriate analogy, a rare bipartisan moment. But it's Facebook that has been taking the most fire, and the social media giant has had a brutal stretch lately. A former Facebook manager turned whistleblower shared thousands of damaging documents with Congress. She told Congress Facebook chooses profits over safety, and that Facebook knew that its hugely popular Instagram app was a danger for teenage girls, creating body image problems. Then an embarrassing outage hit Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook itself. And then there's the so-called Facebook papers, thousands of internal documents reported on by news organizations, including the Times and the Wall Street Journal. Among other things, the documents raise serious questions about Facebook allowing misinformation to spread about the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. So how much heat is Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg feeling under his hoodie? And will there really be a crackdown on big tech? We'll hear from Kara Swisher, an opinion writer for The Times and host of the podcast Sway. You wrote, Kara, and said that Mark Zuckerberg will continue to wield all the real power at Facebook for as long as he wants, but the era of his being the adored dear leader and cultural touchstone is effectively over. So who takes over? Where does he go from here? And is it going to become better and more responsive? And is it up to government to do that, or is it up to the marketplace?
Well, this is inevitable at all tech companies. Bill Gates moved over during that Microsoft trial right after for other executives. And now it's run by Satya Nadella, who is a very well-regarded CEO. And he's not as well known as Bill Gates because he's not the founder, which happens in Silicon Valley. There's sort of an adoration of the founder. The same thing happened at Google. Obviously, Amazon's Jeff Bezos just stepped down and gave over control to his lieutenant, Andy Jassy. So this is not unusual, but what's happening is Mark is doing it under duress, which the others did not particularly. Also, he still maintains control of the company through his voting shares. He has effective control of everything, including for his children and his children's children. The Zuckerbergs will be running Facebook for a very long time.
So what difference will it make in the running of Facebook and the responsiveness of Facebook and the transparency of Facebook?
Well, if he does it in the right way, he creates a conglomerate, which Google did with Alphabet, if you recall, a couple of years ago. And so Larry Page sort of just disappeared. And I think one of the issues is Facebook is the personification of Mark and vice versa. And I think a lot of people feel that there should be a more professionalized environment. Not that he's not talented, not that he's not visionary, but that there should be someone else. And then each of the divisions, like Oculus or WhatsApp or Instagram, they do have their own leaders. That Facebook also has its own leader, because what happens is Facebook sucks up all the oxygen from their other divisions. And therefore, they've got some promising financial services stuff. They've got, obviously Instagram has some issues, but WhatsApp is also in their Oculus. And so they want to shift it away from the big blue app, which is what Facebook is called there internally, and to the rest of the company so that you can see a bigger, wider company and where they're going in the future. But with Mark and Facebook attached to each other in the way they are, it's difficult from a regulatory point of view or a media point of view. And so that's what I think they're doing, moving him to the side, and yet he still maintains control.
You pointed out on the podcast and the Times that Jonathan Cantor in the Justice Department, the Republican Congresswoman Ken Buck, now suggests that there is a moment coming for big tech that it may not want, it may not be expected. What change does this portend in terms of regulation for big tech?
Well, that's been thought about for years. Like, this has been going on for a long time, and effectively Congress has done nothing effective. Effectively they've done nothing effective. I think one of the issues is whether Congress can really pull the pull off passing some of this legislation. There's some very good legislation, and it's very bipartisan. It includes, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Blackburn. Boy, couldn't be more different. Representative Cicilline and Representative Buck, who I just interviewed on Sway. And I've also interviewed David Cicilline from Rhode Island. Couldn't be more different as legislators, but they all agree that something has to be done. And there's a whole raft of different legislation to address all kinds of different issues, not just with Facebook, but all of tech, because every tech company is different. Every issue is different. There's issues about marketplace. There's issues about transparency. There's issues around privacy, around data, around antitrust. And so it has to be dealt with in a number of ways, from legislation to enforcement to antitrust action.
The Facebook revelations are being orchestrated very skillfully, very professionally. How damaging are they, and what do they really tell us about Facebook that we didn't know before?
Well, what's curious is Facebook's done a lot of its research on itself, right? It's reflected itself, and now this stuff is out into the wild. And I think they never intended that to happen. I think it was laudable that they were looking at it. And of course, they were interested for their own business reasons to understand what was happening on the platform. They're particularly worried about young people removing themselves from Facebook services, and that's a big deal. That's sort of an existential issue for that company. And so they also can't buy things, like they couldn't turn around and buy TikTok or whatever happens to be the trendy thing of the day because of the regulatory scrutiny. And so they were looking at themselves, and sort of what they did is hired a lot of civic minded people to do this and try to figure out how to make it a healthier platform, which is what its executives said it wanted, but the executives didn't quite want the results. And so we'll see what comes out with all these different documents, because it covers a range of areas. We talked about the teens, which I think got a lot of attention, but the more serious things are elsewhere. The stuff that was happening abroad, the stuff around giving celebrities and well-known politicians sort of full free reign on the platform, which they said they didn't, but then they did, and all kinds of stuff. So there's more documents coming out because these were initially given to the Wall Street Journal. Now they've been given in a consortium to a bunch of other publications. And so people are finding their own conclusions based on what's coming out. But there's going to be a data dump, I think, for several weeks. This has been Frances Haugen's came to play, as they say, and that's what's interesting is I think Facebook, which is very good at attacking people who disagree with it, having been on the receiving end of it, I think she's done a very interesting job of rolling this out. And of course, there's conspiracy theories around her too, that she's a plant.
Why do people write these things down anymore? I mean, don't they know they're ultimately going to leak something?
They love to write things down. Are you kidding? Right? And also, it's a history. A lot of these companies they live in these digital environments, and they talk and they discuss things just the way we might, or just people in the regular world do. And so this is their medium, and this is how they talk. And unfortunately, they probably weren't thinking it was going to come to this many years ago, but I'm sure there's a treasure trove within all these companies of statements they make between each other that might be seen in a really negative light. Microsoft had that issue too, but not like this. As they say in the movie about Facebook, the social network, the internet is written in indelible ink. And that's one of the problems.
Speaking of indelible ink, you broke your tradition a little bit. You went to the movies to see the James Bond movie, but is that still going to be an aberration? Are people still going to watch more movies at home?
I think that's the pandemic has accelerated all kinds of trends, and I think we've talked about that before, and this is one of them. The movie going experience has been shifting already before the pandemic to streaming in these really terrific home theaters. They're not very expensive, so it reaches down through a lot of people. It's not like just for the rich at all by any means, and people are watching on phones, they're watching on iPads and things like that. And so my whole premise was that, look, the big event movies you're going to go see in the theater possibly, and they're going to have to be experiential, good food, good seats, et cetera, and good popcorn for once. And so my issue is that the movie theaters have been abusing customers for decades, and now they have to be better. And there's still going to be a much smaller business, just the way the theater used to be the place everybody went. And it's not gone. It's just a different experience. And so I think the streaming thing is inevitable, and it's going to be bigger than movie theater going over time. And that's just the way it is, same thing with records and stuff. Like everything's going to be digitized, and people will watch where they want to watch. But the James Bond movie was very nice in IMAX. That's another good example. I wouldn't have gone to see it in a regular theater. Why? It's just as good on my screen at home, but IMAX was cool. So.
Mm-hmm. Donald Trump seems to be doing almost as well raising money for his social media project as he is for his campaigns. What's going to happen with that? And can he compete with Facebook and Twitter, or does he do something entirely different?
I think this is a financial machination. That's all it is. He can't create a new social. I mean, good luck if he does. I like competition, so Godspeed on that one. But the fact of the matter is, nothing exists right now, and he's got some pretty ambitious goals, of which he gave no details and no technological information. So I gotta say, I'm feeling very Trump steak about this. We'll see if it gets to something. But one of the problems is he loves Twitter, and he loves being with the media is there. His critics are there. His fans are there. It's where everybody gathers, for example. That's his favorite medium. And same thing with Facebook. I think the difficulty is he'll create a sort of talk about echo chambers, but he'll create an echo chamber of his own fans. And that's no fun, right? Except for adulation, but he gets a better adulation at his rallies. So it's a financial mechanism, this SPAC route. And we'll see if he makes anything. He's got to be careful, because this is the SEC could get involved in these kind of things. And SPACs are sort of been under fire. There've been too many of them, some of them problematic. And so we'll see what happens here. But he could become a meme stock, and like a lot of others, like AMC and GameStop, except there's no assets here really. And people,
the only asset is his name, I guess.
Yeah, right. So if people buy a hat and a T-shirt, why not buy a share of Donald Trump's stock? I mean, it's I don't know what to call it. It's the trend of our day in the stock market. It's sort of a fan stock, and good luck with that. He'll do fine, but buyer beware. If you're in it for the investment, you could do speculative stuff around it, but it's not. Stuff around cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is substantive. It's actually substantive, even though they have swings and it's very speculative. This is just, there's nothing there, but that's okay. He's done it before. He'll do it again.
Done it before, and he became the president.
Yeah.
Thanks to Kara Swisher of the New York Times, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.